All right, ready to dive in. We've got this EC English guide.
Oh,
It's chock full of tips for learning English.
someone's ambitious.
101 of them, to be exact.
Yep.
101 ways to boost your English skills. But,
That's a lot.
yeah, where do you even begin with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have all that advice, but you don't want to get overwhelmed.
Right, exactly. So for our learner persona, the one who's all about efficiency, yeah, we're going to pinpoint the most impactful, actionable tips from this guide
Sounds good.
to really jumpstart that English learning journey.
Love it.
So one thing that really jumps out like right away is this whole idea of not being afraid to make mistakes. And it's tip number 1, which I think is interesting.
Oh, yeah, putting it right out there.
Yeah, front and center.
It's smart, I think. For a lot of learners, that fear of making mistakes, it could really hold them back.
Oh, absolutely.
So by addressing it head on, the guide kind of gives them permission to,
Go for it.
yeah, just go for it. Make those mistakes. Because that's how you learn.
It's like you don't learn to ride a bike by just reading about it. You got to get on.
And fall a few times.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to wobble a bit. Now, speaking of motivation, the guide also talks about goal setting, which makes sense.
Sure.
The classic advice is to set like a long-term goal, maybe passing an exam or reaching a certain level of fluency. But then it takes this interesting turn, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
It talks about connecting with like the intrinsic motivations. So it's not just about, the external markers of achievement.
It's the why. Like, why are you learning English? What do you want to be able to do with it?
Exactly, yeah. What doors will it open for you? What experiences will it unlock?
I think that's key for our learner persona. You
Yeah.
know, they're driven by that desire to
Make it meaningful.
make it meaningful. Exactly.
Yeah.
They want to be able to actually use this knowledge.
Absolutely, yeah. And it ties in nicely with that other advice about setting smaller, more achievable goals along the way.
Right. Break it down.
Like steps 16 and 59 in the guide.
Yeah. Instead of looking at this huge mountain you have to climb, it's like taking it
One step at a time.
one step at a time.
Yeah, makes it less intimidating for sure.
Much more manageable. Now, here's where I think the guide gets really interesting. It really encourages learners to go beyond the textbook
Oh, yeah.
and learn English in the real world. Tip number 38, it actually says, and I'm quoting here,
Yeah.
you can't learn English only from a book.
I mean, they're not wrong.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
Language is all about communication.
Right.
And you can't really do that just by, staring at a page.
It's like those immersion programs where you're just kind of,
Thrown in the deep end.
yeah, exactly. Sink or swim.
Yeah, and while not everyone can, hop on a plane and go live in an English-speaking country, there are still ways to get that real-world experience.
Oh, for sure.
Like finding language exchange partners online, attending meetups, even just, talking to yourself in English throughout the day.
Oh, and then there's that tip about labeling everything in your house
Ah, yes, the Post-it note method.
with Post-it notes. I love that one.
Visual learner.
Totally. Yeah. And it's fun. It's memorable.
It is.
Definitely fits with our learner persona who likes those,
Practical tip.
practical, concrete steps. Speaking of practical steps, optimizing study habits, that's another big theme in the guide.
Time management is key, especially for busy learners.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the first pieces of advice they give is to really know yourself.
Figure out what works for you.
Yeah, like when are you most productive? What's your learning style? Are you a visual learner, an auditory learner?
It's foundational.
It is, yeah, because once you know that, you can tailor your study sessions to really maximize, your focus and retention.
Makes sense.
So it's all about, working smarter, not just
Harder.
And then they talk about utilizing those little pockets of time throughout the day.
Oh, those are gold.
Yeah, those commutes, waiting in line, even, washing the dishes.
Multitasking.
You can turn them into mini learning opportunities. Every little bit adds up, right?
It does.
It's like, every journey begins with a single step, or maybe, in this case, a single vocabulary word.
Learned while you're waiting for your coffee to brew.
Exactly, yeah. All right, so let's move on to mastering those core skills, starting with reading. I noticed some really cool techniques in the guide for building confidence and fluency,
Oh, yeah, the reading section is packed with good stuff.
especially for our learner persona. So what stood out to you there?
I like the idea of starting with familiar material, like rereading a book you already enjoyed in your native language, but this time in English,
Mm-hmm.
or using graded readers, which are specifically designed for different levels.
Oh, like training wheels for your reading comprehension?
Exactly. It's about building that foundation and easing into it. You don't want to get discouraged right off the bat.
No, absolutely not. And then they have this whole step-by-step process for extracting meaning from articles, which I thought was super helpful.
Yeah, breaks that nicely.
So first, you just read from the gist without getting bogged down in every single word.
Skimming for the main idea.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then you identify those keywords, maybe try to guess their meaning from context, and then you look them up to confirm.
Ah, good old context clues.
Yep. And then here's the best part.
Okay.
You tell someone about the article using those newly learned words.
Putting it into practice. That's how it sticks.
That's how it sticks, right?
I like it. And of course, we can't forget about vocabulary building. The guide has tons of tips for that too. Learning different forms of a word, understanding prefixes and suffixes.
Oh, and grouping words by category.
That's a good one. It's about seeing the patterns in the language, not just memorizing lists of words.
Yeah, makes it so much easier to remember. Okay, so from the page to the ear, the guide also tackles pronunciation, which can be tricky
It can be.
for English learners. And one thing that surprised me was how much they emphasized this sound called the schwa.
The schwa?
Yeah, it's like this neutral vowel sound, kind of like in the word about
Oh, right.
or the.
Mhm.
Seems pretty basic, but they make a big deal about it. Why is that?
Well, it might not seem like much, but the schwa is actually the most common vowel sound in English.
Really?
Yeah, and mastering it can really help with understanding connected speech.
Oh, interesting.
Because when words are spoken together, those unstressed vowels often reduce to that schwa sound.
Yeah.
So it all blends together more smoothly.
Makes sense, yeah. It's like the glue that holds spoken English together.
Exactly. And speaking of connected speech, the guide also encourages learners to pay attention to how words change when they're spoken together.
It's not always how it looks on the page.
Right, there's a difference between, textbook pronunciation and how native speakers actually talk. Like watching movies with subtitles can be really helpful for this.
Oh yeah, you start to notice those patterns.
You do.
How it all flows together. And I like how the guide balances those kind of technical aspects of pronunciation with more creative approaches.
Oh, absolutely. Like using music to improve intonation and rhythm.
Music, yeah.
That's a fun one.
It is. And who doesn't love music, right?
Exactly.
And then, of course, there's the classic tip of recording yourself speaking.
Oh, yeah, that can be really eye-opening.
It is, yeah. Sometimes you don't even realize,
What you sound like.
yeah, what you sound like until you hear it back.
And it's a great way to, identify areas you need to work on. Okay, track your progress.
Absolutely. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from tackling that fear of making mistakes to optimizing those study habits.
And those core reading and speaking skills.
You mastering those core skills, right? But the guide doesn't stop there. It goes even deeper
Yeah, there's more.
into some more nuanced aspects of language learning, which I'm sure our learner persona will appreciate.
Let's dive into those advanced techniques then. I'm curious to see what they've got. So digging into those advanced techniques, one that stood out to me was the focus on phrasal verbs.
Those can be tricky.
They can be, yeah. Those combinations of verbs and prepositions like get up, give up, look
Ooh,
out.
Yeah, they seem simple enough.
Right, but they can have so many different meanings.
And they don't always translate literally, which can be confusing.
Exactly, and that's why the guide emphasizes learning them in context, not just memorizing lists.
Makes sense. You got to see how they're actually used in sentences.
Yeah, otherwise it's like trying to understand a joke by only hearing the punchline.
You're missing the whole setup.
Exactly. And speaking of context, there's this other tip that I thought was interesting about using those little filler words, like and
Oh, those. I always try to avoid those.
I know, right? We think they make us sound less fluent.
Yeah, but I've noticed that native speakers use them all the time.
They do. And it's actually for a reason. They use them to signal that they're still thinking or to give themselves a moment to gather their thoughts.
So it's not about speaking perfectly smoothly without any pauses.
Not at all. In fact, trying to do that can sound unnatural. Those little fillers actually make you sound more human, more like a real person.
Huh. That's interesting. It's like conversation is more of a back and forth, a give and take.
Exactly. And the guide talks about that too, the importance of active listening, responding thoughtfully, keeping the conversation going.
Yeah, it's a two-way street.
It is. And speaking of give and take, there's this concept of chunks of language that I thought was really helpful.
Chunks.
Yeah, like instead of thinking about individual words, you start to recognize how words group together to form phrases idioms, common expressions.
Ah, idioms. Those are fun.
They are, but they can be tricky too, especially for learners. The guide's advice is to focus on recognizing them, even if you're not comfortable using them yet.
Right. It's about expanding your understanding of the language.
Yeah, and appreciating the richness and the nuance.
Yeah.
And speaking of nuance, the guide also touches on the concept of register.
Register.
Yeah, it's about matching your language to the situation.
Mm.
So, knowing when to use formal versus informal language, slang versus professional vocabulary.
Ah, so like you wouldn't talk to your boss the same way you talk to your friends.
Exactly. It's about developing that sensitivity to the social context of language, which goes hand in hand with cultural awareness.
And that makes me think about the guide's emphasis on cultural immersion.
Yeah.
You know, studying abroad, mixing with people from different cultures.
It's about experiencing the language in its natural habitat, so to speak.
Yeah, it's like learning the unspoken rules of a game. You might know the basic moves, but understanding the etiquette and the strategy takes you to a whole new level.
Absolutely. And speaking of taking it to the next level, there's this one tip that I found really fascinating about using image training to boost fluency.
Image training. I've never heard of that.
It's about mentally rehearsing conversations before you have them.
Oh, interesting.
So, for example, if you're planning to go to a restaurant, you imagine yourself in that scenario. Picture the waiter approaching, anticipate the questions they might ask, and practice your responses in your head.
So it's like a dress rehearsal for real life interaction?
Exactly. And it ties into the guide's suggestion to prepare stories or anecdotes ahead of time so you have something engaging to share in social situations.
Ah, so you're not caught off guard, you have something to say.
Right. It's all about building confidence and reducing anxiety. Now, while the guide does mention some EC-specific resources like their language centers and online platforms,
Sure.
there are also a lot of universal tips that apply to anyone learning English, regardless of their methods.
Yeah, those are the real gems.
They are. And one that I think is really important is the emphasis on choosing qualified English teachers, not just native speakers.
That's a good point. Speaking a language and teaching it are two different things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Teaching requires a whole other set of skills. Understanding pedagogy, learning styles, creating a supportive learning environment.
And I think that highlights the overall message of the guide, which is to find what works best for you.
It's all about personalization.
Yeah. Figure out your learning style, experiment with different approaches, create a learning journey that fits your individual needs and goals.
It's about empowering learners to take ownership of their learning.
Love that. Now, before we wrap up, there are a couple more nuggets of wisdom I want to touch on. The guide really stresses the importance of staying positive and celebrating those small victories along the way.
Oh, that's so important. Learning a language can be a long journey, and it's not always easy.
No, there are definitely going to be bumps in the road.
But it's about acknowledging those bumps and keeping your eye on the prize and celebrating every little win, no matter how small.
Exactly. It's those small wins that keep you motivated and moving forward.
They do. And speaking of motivation, the guide also reminds us to enjoy the process. If you're not having fun, you're less likely to stick with it.
Shouldn't feel like a chore.
Right. Find those aspects of language learning that you enjoy, whether it's listening to music, watching movies, chatting with friends, even labeling everything in your house with Post-it notes.
Whatever works for you, make it your own.
Exactly. And speaking of making it your own, I love how the guide reframes the idea of struggling with language learning. It's not because you're bad at languages.
Oh, I like that.
It's because you haven't found your unique learning style yet.
That's such a positive way to look at it. It's about experimentation and discovery.
It is. It's like trying on different hats until you find one that fits just right.
I love that analogy. All right, so as we come to the end of our deep dive into these 101 tips, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. What are some key takeaways that you hope our learner will walk away with?
Thinking about it all, I'd say one of the biggest takeaways is that whole idea of mindset. The guide really emphasizes approaching English learning as a journey.
Not a race.
Not a race, exactly. It's going to have its ups and downs. There will be plateaus.
It's not always going to be easy.
No, definitely not. But it's about embracing those challenges, and remembering that progress. It's not always linear.
It's about the long game.
The long game, yeah.
Mhm.
And celebrating those small victories along the way.
Those are so important.
They really are. It's like those little wins, they keep you going.
They keep you motivated.
Exactly. And the other big thing, I think, is personalization. The guide really encourages learners to find what works best for them.
Find your own flavor.
Your own flavor, yeah. Whether it's music, podcasts, conversations, even those Post-it notes, whatever it is, If it works for you, stick with it.
It's like finding that secret ingredient, you know? The one that makes the whole dish come alive.
Yeah, I like that. It's
Yeah.
about making it your own, making it enjoyable.
Because if it's not enjoyable, you're not going to stick with it, right?
Exactly. And speaking of enjoyment, I love how the guide reminds us to savor the process.
Mm.
Learning English, it's not just about reaching a destination.
It's about the journey itself.
It is, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's about those little discoveries along the way, those aha
When
moments.
something finally clicks.
Yes, like a new word or a grammar rule, and it just makes sense.
It's like finding a hidden treasure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of treasures, I want to circle back to that tip we talked about earlier about embracing mistakes.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is. And the guide keeps coming back to it. It's not about being afraid of making mistakes,
It's about learning from them.
learning from them, yeah. It's about seeing those stumbles as opportunities for growth, not as failures.
I love that perspective shift.
It's so important.
Mhm.
And I think that really sums up the spirit of this guide. It's not about giving you a rigid set of rules or a one-size-fits-all approach.
It's about empowering learners.
Empowering them, exactly,
Yeah.
to find their own path, to experiment, to embrace the messiness of it all, and most importantly, to have fun while they're doing it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into these 101 tips for learning English. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
All right, let's hear it.
Think about how you approach learning a language. Does it reflect how you approach learning anything new? What connections can you draw between your experiences with English and your experiences with other skills or areas of knowledge?
That's a good one. Something to ponder.
Something to ponder, yeah.
Yeah.
And on that note, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep embracing that joy of lifelong learning. Happy learning, everyone.
Happy learning, everyone.